Hello, everyone. Welcome to the session on measuring racial ethnic disparities with ACS data. My name is Lillian Kilduff, and I'm a research analyst at PRB. We have three great presentations today, and we're going to start off with our first presenter, Clemens Nolke.
All right, thank you, Lillian. My name is Clemens Nölke. I'm the research director for the diversitydatakits.org project. My co-authors are Dolores Acevedo Garcia and Robert Wessler, and we're based at the Heller School at Brandeis University. The title of our talk is Does Spatial Aggregation Affect Racial Ethnic Inequities in Access to Neighborhood Opportunity? Census tracts are widely used to identify children's residential environments, but they can be cumbersome to work with. In any person-level data set, you don't have individual census tract IDs unless someone collected person-level addresses, cleaned and geocoded them. That's a high bar to cross in many settings. Data on zip codes is more easily collected, more readily available, and easier to work with. There are about 73,000 census tracts and around half as many zip codes. So zip codes are less granular and may therefore not capture meaningful fine-grained differences in children's residential environments. What we like to do here is quantify that imprecision with a focus on how well zip code data capture racial ethnic inequities in access to neighborhood opportunity. Do we still have reliable estimates of children's neighborhood opportunity at the zip code level? If zip code estimates are unreliable, does this affect children of different racial ethnic groups in different ways? To illustrate, here's a zip code near the north side of Chicago. These are the 13 census tracts it is partially or fully comprised of, colored in terms of that level of child opportunity, with light blue indicating very low and dark blue indicating very high opportunity. If you aggregate this census tract data to the zip code level, you obtain moderate for the zip code, but its tract values vary between low, moderate, high, and very high opportunity. So the zip code average poorly captures the variation across the census tracts it's comprised of. It's a biased estimate of the neighborhood context children in the different parts of the zip code actually experience. And this bias is not neutral with respect to race ethnicity, which is what we will show now. Our main ingredients are census tract level data on neighborhood characteristics and population that we aggregate to the zip code level using crosswalks provided by HUD. We're looking at 4 neighborhood measures of child opportunity from different sources that capture different facets of child opportunity: life expectancy at birth in years, the Child Opportunity Index 2.0, which includes several measures from the ACS, a measure of intergenerational economic mobility from the Opportunity Atlas, and the poverty rate from the ACS. We merge the census tract data on a crosswalk that links census tracts to zip codes and then aggregate the census tract data up to the zip code level.
Hi, Clemens. Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to let you know that your slides are not in full screen mode. I think you have them in the notes presentation.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, it's in full screen now. Thank you so much.
So let's maybe start with the distribution of children across zip codes of different sizes. About 60% of Hispanic, Black, and Asian children live in zip codes that are comprised of 10 or more census tracts, but only 40% of white children do. So if there is a variation across census tracts in the way I've just showed in the example for the Chicago zip code, then the zip code level estimates for these groups would be less reliable than compared to white children, for example. So how can we look at this? So one way of looking at this reliability issue by race ethnicity is to look at by how much the average neighborhood outcomes for white children, let's say, differs from the outcome of children in the zip code overall. So what we did is for each outcome, zip code, and racial ethnic group, we calculated the proportion of the zip code population for that group that lives in a specific tract, and multiplied that with the tract outcome, and summed the products across tracts for each zip code. And this gives us, at the zip code level, the average neighborhood characteristics for a child of a given race ethnicity in that zip code. And then we calculate a gap at the zip code level between the average outcome for children of a given group minus the outcome for children overall, or just the average zip code level outcome. And here are the median gaps across all zip codes for 4 different outcomes and 5 different racial ethnic groups. The typical white child, for example, lives in a census tract that has a neighborhood opportunity a little bit above the zip code average. I should say all the outcomes are standardized, so the y-axis is in units of standard deviations. The typical black child lives in a census tract with an opportunity that is below the zip code average. Hispanic, Latino children similar, slightly below, Asian Pacific Islander slightly above, Native American slightly below. But overall, these differences are really quite small, below 10% of a standard deviation. However, that's just part of the picture. Now let's look at all the other percentiles. So what we did here is we took the the average outcomes for white children in a zip code and subtracted the overall zip code outcome, and that gives us the gap between white children's outcome and the zip code average outcome. And then we ranked all zip codes in terms of this gap from lowest to highest, grouped them into 100 groups, and then calculated the median gap within each of those groups of zip codes. And as you can see here, most white children live in census tracts for whom the outcome does not differ much at all from the zip code level outcome. So, which is to say that overall, the zip code estimates reproduce white children's neighborhood opportunity quite well compared to what it would be at the census tract level, with the caveat, as you can see at the right end of the distribution, there is a certain percentage of white children with neighborhood opportunity that is above the zip code. So there's about 2% of white children who live in census tracts with an outcome that's about 50% of a standard deviation above the zip code, which corresponds to about 2 years of life expectancy at birth, or 6 percentage points of the poverty rate. I should say that I'm missing my notes now, but I should say that the outcomes are standardized, and overall the patterns are so similar across the 4 outcomes we've examined here that we average the outcomes into one index, and that's what we're showing the results here for. So for African American children, the pattern is quite different. There, the zip code averages overestimate the opportunity compared to the census tract where Black children actually live within a zip code. So for about 60% of the Black population, that's the case. So the zip code average is above the census tract average. And that gap gets quite large here at the lower tail, reaching or exceeding 50% of a standard deviation. For Hispanic and Latino children, the pattern is similar to Black children at the top, but the gaps are a little less as large at the bottom of the distribution. For American Native children, there's large gaps both at the top and the bottom of the distribution. So for this group, the zip code measures work least well. And for Asian Pacific Islander children, the gaps track the one for white children at the upper end, and for Hispanic children at the lower end of the distribution. So Here we've drawn lines at 25% of a standard deviation, and gaps that fall within those bounds you might consider to be less problematic, and gaps that fall outside might be more problematic. So 93% of white children live in census tracts that are, or live in zip codes where the zip code level estimate is close to the census tract estimate. The corresponding number for Hispanic children is 92%. But for Black or African American children, that number is only 80%, and it's 64% for American Indian or Alaska Native children. So about 40% of American Indian, Alaska Native children live in zip codes where the zip code level estimate is really a poor representation of the patterns that you would measure at the census tract level. So zip code estimates of neighborhood opportunity have good quality for a large majority of white children, but they are compromised for non-white children, especially Black and Native American children. Can they still be used though for broader to study broader regional patterns and access to neighborhood opportunity? So I've said, for a large proportion of the population, the gaps are actually quite small, and there may be a bias cancellation in both directions. There may be bias cancellation. So if you look at large samples of zip codes, maybe you can recover overall or broader patterns of equity quite well, even if individual zip code measures aren't quite accurate. And here the answer seems to be in tendency yes, at least for the kinds of tests we did. So what we did is, first using census tract data, we calculated the average neighborhood outcomes for each racial ethnic group across all neighborhoods in a given metro in the 100 largest metro areas. And then we calculated a gap as the metro level gap in the average outcome for white children minus the average outcome for a given racial ethnic group. So we did that once using census tract data, and then we repeated that with zip code data. And then we calculated a gap. So we subtracted the let's say the black-white gap that we calculated using zip code data from the black-white gap we calculated using census tract data. And our expectation is that that gap should be positive on average if racial ethnic gaps are larger in census tract data. So let's start with the Hispanic white gap. You see, so what you see is the smooth count of this gap of metro areas with a given gap. You see the peak here is close to 0. So in most metro areas, the Hispanic white gap is practically the same if you measure it with the zip code or census tract data. Shown here the gaps for the 10 largest metro, the 10 metro areas with the largest Hispanic Latino population, and they all fall within 10% of a standard deviation around 0. So for the most part, drawing these broader inferences seems to work quite well in zip code data. There are some exceptions that we list in the paper. For the black-white gap, there's a bit more. The discrepancies are a bit larger between zip code and census tract data, but again, for most of the largest metro areas accounting for a large share of the Black and African American population, zip code data work quite well. So if you don't have census tract data, can you use zip code data instead? So the answer depends on what you want to use the data for. The answer is yes, with important exceptions. If you plan to study broader patterns of racial ethnic equity and access to neighborhood opportunity across a large number of zip codes, for example, in a state, a metro area, a large metro area, or nationally, there are biases when you're looking at broader patterns tend to be small, for example, for the Asian white, Hispanic white, or black white gaps, with some exceptions that we'll note in the paper. There's a sizable bias, though, for the Native American white gap. So for this group, it doesn't work. So broader patterns works, at least to us, work surprisingly well, unless you're, of course, trying to draw inferences about specific zip codes. So if you are focused on or targeting specific zip codes for a place-based intervention, for example, then yeah, this doesn't work. Yeah? You risk missing potentially important target areas in heterogeneous zip codes. You might invest into high opportunity areas within that zip code rather than low opportunity areas, and that way exacerbate racial ethnic inequalities. In supplementary analysis we show that the within census tract, within zip code inequalities you see, they are very strongly correlated with racial ethnic composition. So if you don't have census tract data for your outcome, you can look at data on racial ethnic composition at the census tract level instead, and in that way identify your sort of specific neighborhoods for intervention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Clemens. And I would like to say that if you have any questions for Clemens or any questions for any of the other presenters, please click on the Q&A icon and enter your questions there. I will not be asking questions that are in chat. The chat feature is just used to talk to your fellow attendees. Up next, we have Keith Wiley. Keith, you were on mute.
Okay, sorry about that. I work with a small nonprofit here in Washington, D.C., and we specialize in rural housing and rural affordable housing in rural communities. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about high poverty rural Southeast, an area that we're going to focus in a little bit more this time. We do a report every 10 years. It's called Taking Stock. And basically, it's a report on rural America, and it largely talks about housing issues, but also economics and other characteristics that matter. And so we're thinking about it incorporating the rural Southeast. We think part of that may be missing in like as high need areas. So as background, I'm just going to talk a little bit about high needs areas or regions as they're currently defined. And I'll just note some of the research on the rural Southeast and some of the high poverty and essentially what is known as the Black Belt region. Then I'll talk about how we are going to define it. We're going to focus essentially like we usually do at HAC on Housing Assistance Council on high poverty rural census tracts. And we're going to focus on areas that aren't currently being covered, that aren't part of the lower Mississippi Delta or Central Appalachia. And then we'll just talk in brief, mainly descriptives about how this area relates to other high need regions, and also some of the housing characteristics, just to describe some of the, in general terms, the differences that exist. Now here's a map of high needs regions as is most commonly recognized and ones we normally work with. So you see in orange is the border colonies down near the Mexico-Texas border, the bright orange. Then there's the kind of the burnt orangey color from the Native American lands in the west. And then there's a lighter orange around the lower Mississippi Delta. And then there is a pink color around Central Appalachia. And what I've also put in here is the boundaries, is the gray line boundaries, the polygon boundaries for the persistent poverty counties. And most of them are included in these high need regions, except for a few down around Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and the panhandle of Florida. And that's what we are trying to capture. That's also another concentrated area of high poverty, largely rural. And we were hoping that maybe we could pick it up. I think about 70% of the persistent poverty counties that aren't already in one of these high need regions are there. And so that's what we're trying to do. And when we do Taking Stock every 10 years, we go back to these regions and we talk about them and we talk about their housing needs. And this year, we're going to probably include some talk on this region. Now, there's been a good bit of research on it, and it's pretty fascinating. And most of the research that we see on the region that I found talks about essentially what's called the Black Belt. And it runs from Texas to Virginia, and it's like states in the old Confederacy. And what they do is they're looking at the percent of population, it's African American. And there's some great work by like Wimberly and Morris where they define that region as any county that has more than like 12 or 13% African American population. And that covers from the lower Mississippi Delta on. But the definition does vary a lot. And there's some definitions that are more of a geology-based definition based on like ground, and some that only consider the Delta to be in Alabama and Mississippi. But most of the research, and like by Wimberly and Morris, ultimately has led to 2008 Congress created what they called the Southeast Crescent Commission. And this commission, basically kind of similar to the Appalachian Regional Commission or the Lower Mississippi Delta Commission, is kind of set up to define an area and you maybe work on resources to that area. And it includes states from Virginia to Florida. And it has the exception that does not cover any areas that would already be covered under a high need region. So that's kind of what we're focusing on right there. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. But here's a map I made. And you can see in the darker green, I essentially duplicated what Wimberly and Morris did, but counties with their population, African-American population, the Black Belt. And then I put in red, I outlined the states that make up the Southeast Crescent region. So you can see they include most of these areas. And that's kind of what we're looking for. And so by definition, what we're going to do is we're going to use the framework for the commission. Essentially, we're looking only at those 7 states. And we're looking at places that aren't in Central Appalachia or the lower Mississippi Delta. But for our analysis, we focus on rural, and we try to focus on areas of most need, which would be higher poverty. So we use a census tract-based geography here, not the county-based. And what we're doing is we're identifying census tracts that are rural based on housing unit density and commuting patterns. It's a definition that my boss, Lance George, developed. It's a really good definition. So it classifies census tracts as rural, suburban, or urban. In this case, we're only pulling out the rural ones. And then we're going to focus a little bit on our talk about the high poverty ones, which is census tracts that have 20% or higher poverty. And that's the definition we have. And that leads to this map I have here. I know it looks a little bit like a Warshak photo, but what it is, the light green are the rural census tracts that have high poverty, and they're in that crescent region. And the darker green are ones that don't, they're rural and they would be part of the region, but they're not high poverty. And I know it's hard to tell because census tract size varies, but about 2,500 or so are in the region in total, and about 910 are high poverty. And that's the ones that's the ones we're going to focus most of our talk on. Now, I just have a few background slides, and all that I like to point out is these areas have many things in common, these high need regions, and this area is very similar to the other ones. And this is just the percent of population in those high poverty tracts. And you can see that Native American stands out at 71% because we define it even more precise. It's a tract where 75% or more of the land area is a federal reservation land or trust land. But the other ones are a little closer, like 56% of the population in the border colonies region is in a high poverty tract, 49 for the Delta, 45 for Central Appalachia, and 41 for the Southeast. It's considerably higher in those regions than rural areas in general. And actually in the Southeast, if you take out Virginia, it's pretty much a duplicate of the lower Mississippi Delta. It goes up to like 47 or 48%. So that's a commonality. Another commonality is rural areas are often considered monolithic by people and mainly non-white. That's not true in most of the areas where the non-white population is concentrated. Unfortunately, happen to be in these high need regions as related to poverty and stuff. And you'll see like the border colonies, about 65% of the population is Hispanic or Latino. Native American lands, 60% is Native American. And for the Delta and Southeast, it's about 25% African American, about a quarter of the population there is African American. The exception to this rule is Central Appalachia, which is almost overwhelmingly white. But again, you'll find those populations, and when you find them in these rural areas, you often find a disproportionate share of poverty. And this is just that Southeast region broken down by state. And you can see here, like what it shows is for Alabama, in that part of that Southeast region, about 18.2% of the population was African American or Hispanic, but 30% of the population in poverty was African American or Hispanic. And in like the case of South Carolina, the rural Southeast part, 41% of the population was African American or Latino, but they made up 60% of the population in poverty, which is again the concentration in the high poverty. And if you look at it one more way in a similar kind of fashion, I'm sorry I put a lot of bars here together. I try to only do this once or twice. but you can look at the population living in a high poverty census tract by race. And you can see, like, I'll just pick out Georgia. So 43% of the white non-Hispanic population in this rural areas lived in a high poverty census tract, but 70% of the rural African Americans did, and 62% of the Hispanic population. So they got high poverty rates in general, and then they're concentrated in overall areas with high poverty rates, which is really, has a very tough impact on people and outcomes a lot of times. Now I'm going to go through some housing characteristics. I'm going to try to do this real fast. This is just a general slide I like to put up because I grew up in a rural place, and I think people don't think some of the problems in rural areas are the same as other places. This just basically shows homeownership rate for white non-Hispanic and then everybody else. And the reason why I like this, because it shows that there's a gap in rural areas just like there are in urban areas. So like in the US, in rural areas, it's 75% home ownership for white non-Hispanic compared to 55% for not white Hispanic. But if you go over to the Delta, it's large too. It's 77% and 53%. So this is an ongoing problem. The problem is that they're just more pronounced, because I know a lot of times people think just rural areas, everybody owns their own home. That's not necessarily true, and particularly for rural minorities. And here's just a comparison by state of the home ownership rate in the high poverty tracts. And you can see, like in Alabama, 71% of the white non-Hispanic households white non-Hispanic households own their own home compared to 49% for African Americans. And you see, like in Georgia, it's 70% of white non-Hispanic households in a high poverty tract own their own home, but only 46% for African Americans. So it's a pretty huge gap, similar to the national one, but it's like 30%. And essentially, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of households here. And since wealth generation is a real important thing in this country, and a lot of it's through housing, it has a big impact. And manufactured housing is important in rural areas. And so I like to point this out because in areas like in metropolitan areas, people don't see it a lot, but 13% of the US rural housing stock is manufactured homes, and 22% of it in Southeast, that region overall is, and 24% in those high poverty areas is. So about 1 in every 4 houses is a manufactured home. And I made this slide of the mapping the area. And the reason why I did it was just to show, I think some people might think it might be along the coast, or might be picking up something like communities, manufactured home communities. No, it has pretty widespread coverage. This is every census tract where it's estimated a third or more of the homes are manufactured homes. So it covers a wide swath. A lot of these are very poor, lower income areas in the rural Southeast. And then if we look at this figure, it can be a little confusing, but what it says is like in Florida, 22% of housing stock in rural areas is owned by non-white, manufactured homes is owned by non-white households, but 55% in high poverty areas. In Georgia, 34% of the manufactured housing stock is owned by minorities or non-white households, but 65% in high poverty areas. So I like to do this because I think a lot of times people associate manufactured housing just with like Appalachia and areas like that, but it's not. It's an important housing stock, and it's a really important housing stock actually in these areas and for these populations. So one of the other areas we look at is crowding. In this one, I tried to break it out by white, Black, and Hispanic or Latino. And you see the numbers for the Southeast rural and Southeast rural high poverty. And you see it's over 15% for Hispanic population in the Southeast rural high poverty areas, crowded units. That's essentially, and that population is growing. It's small now, but I think it might have been 600,000 with the data here. So it's an ongoing problem. In large ways, it reflects affordable housing issues. And this is just to show the difference between not high poverty and high poverty tracts for Hispanic, Latino crowded housing. And you can see there's a considerable difference, and it's quite high for almost all states in the high poverty areas for this population. And the last 2 slides that I have any figures on is the one I like to show. It's the good census data on the how homes by year built. And what you can see is the total for the entire Southeast region, the rural part, and the rural high poverty part. And what I show is essentially that the homes built since 2010 or later in the rural high poverty rural high poverty census tracts is only 4% compared to 7% overall. But then if you look at the percentage of housing stock built before 1970, it's 31% of the rural high poverty tracts compared to 23% overall and 27% for rural in general. And what this reflects is the lack of investment, the lack of building, and the lack of activity in these regions, which you might expect, but I think still it's an important thing to think about. And finally, this one hits home to me a lot. I have a daughter. It's access to computer and broadband. And we know now how vitally important, if we didn't already, it is. And this is looking at particularly picked not high poverty rural tracts, and it's by race. So it essentially says in Georgia, 68% of African Americans lived in a household that didn't have access to a computer and broadband. But only 68% did, compared to 80% for white non-Hispanic. So that difference is really important. And you can see for African Americans, it's much lower, the people that had full access to this. And that's a big issue. And again, it kind of relates to the development and the overall need in the area. And finally, that commission that I talked about earlier was established in 2008. It had never had a chair appointed, and it's been listed as inactive ever since then. But later this year, it's supposed to get a co-chair. And the annual appropriations are supposed to increase to 1 million. So I think this might be now an impetus for like data like this, and a more closer analysis of it could help guide the efforts of the chair of that committee. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Keith. And just as a reminder, please enter your questions into the Q&A, and I will be asking your questions to the presenters at the end of this session. Next up, we have Jing Li.
Hi, thanks for the opportunity of presenting our research. I want to also thank my co-author, Isao Take. He is in the audience and is with time difference, and he is actually in Japan in midnight, about 4 o'clock a.m., I think. So our study is in comparison to our previous presenter, Keith. This is about Asian American housing. Actually, we focus on urban housing. So our title is Home Ownership and the Residential Crowding Among Chinese, Asian Indians, Filipinos, Vietnamese, Koreans, and Japanese Americans. So a little bit background about our study is that past the study have found that Asian Americans as a whole tend to have similar SES compared to non-Hispanic whites. Most frequently used SES indicators among past studies are education, income, employment, and occupations. There are relatively fewer studies on housing outcomes. So it's very important to study housing. First of all, is this American dream that working hard and owning properties, right? But also housing has a long list of benefits. It is one of the major social determinants of health and well-being. Housing is also well studied in terms of as a key mechanism to wealth accumulation. Past studies have already established a causal link between these two, and there are strong correlation between children's education outcomes and housing. There are great implications for residential assimilation of immigrants. Excuse me. This is particularly important for Asian Americans because a large proportion of Asian Americans are immigrants. Housing also helps promote community building by inducing higher participation in civic and volunteering activities. In terms of housing outcomes, most studies focus on home ownership. This is probably the #1 studied housing outcome. Other outcomes such as housing values, housing stability, and housing quality are much less studied. Residential crowding as an indicator of housing quality is less studied as well. And that is one of the focus of our study. It's important to study it because residential crowding not only limits privacy, but it's also associated with poor physical and mental health, as well as lower education attainment among youth. I guess this is most important, as we can all attest to, that in the past year, during pandemic, residential crowding can be is especially detrimental to remote working and remote learning. So previous studies on Asian American housing found that Asian Americans in general tend to have a lower rate of home ownership compared to whites and the national average. And the studies also found that Asian Americans still face housing discrimination. In some cases, it is as high as Blacks, but it also varies by ethnicity and locations. Immigration status and the special patterns of residence are major explanations of Asian American home ownership disadvantages. Immigration variables such as English language proficiency and duration of stay in the US play an important role in home ownership. Although some studies also found that some foreign-born Asians have a particularly rapid trajectory into home ownership, so it's not necessarily 100% linked to disadvantage. Traditional values traditional cultural norms of value properties and the living in multi-generational and extended family households probably also contributes to their home ownership preferences. Immigrants are also in general tend to be more geographically mobile than the native born, which does not usually encourage home ownership. Past studies also found that there is a large ethnic variation in Asian American home ownership. So our research goals are twofold. One is to systematically investigate home ownership and residential crowding of Asian American households in reference to non-Hispanic whites. Second is to provide an updated Asian American housing profile with a special focus on nativity status and ethnicity. So the data we use are the 5-year American Community Survey from 2013 to 2017. We limited our sample to single race, non-Hispanic Asian Indians, Chinese, Filipinos, Japanese, Koreans, and the Vietnamese aged between 25 to 64. Those are the 6 major Asian American groups. We also included single race non-Hispanic whites aged between 25 to 64 as a comparison group. We limit our sample to the people who live in top 100 most populous metropolitans according to the 2010 US Census. In our final Asian American sample, we have 29% of Chinese, 5% are Japanese, 16% are Filipinos, 28% are Asian Indians, and Koreans, Vietnamese, both constitutes 11%. Our housing outcomes include home ownership and residential crowding. So it's basically both are dummy variables. And so I'm going to just skip the next about our variables. Our variables are at both householder level and the households level. So we focus on 2 major variables, independent variables, which are race, ethnicity, and nativity status. We have other social demographic variables including age, gender, marital status, education, years of US experience. At household level, we have the logged family income, household linguistic isolation status. I really appreciate this variable from ACS IPUMS. Household size, presence of children, and the number of workers in the household. Finally, we included residential mobility to measure, which is measured by whether the householder is moved in the last year. So here we use metropolitan fixed effects, and we have 4 models. In the baseline model, we have the race ethnicity and the metropolitan fixed effects survey years and the residential mobility. That is our baseline model. In the second model, we included a nativity status and interaction between race, ethnicity, and nativity. In the third model, we added social demographic variables. And in the last model, we also added household characteristics. Here is our descriptive statistics. All the differences are statistically significant. You can see that Asian American households tend to be younger, more predominantly male, and more likely to be married. In terms of education levels, Asian Americans as a whole also tend to be more concentrated in the lowest and highest ends of the education spectrum. A striking difference between Asian Americans and non-Hispanic white households is that 84% of Asian Americans are foreign-born versus only 7% of whites. Among immigrants, Asian Americans also tend to be less long-term compared to non-Hispanic whites, as you can see from the US experience variable. Compared to whites, Asian American households also tend to be bigger in size and more linguistically isolated, and more likely to have children under 18, have more workers, and have higher residential mobility in the last year. So with that in mind, here is the weighted home ownership rates of Asian and white Americans home ownership rates in the top 100 most popular metropolitans, and you can see that white as a reference group is at the bottom, and above that is the total Asian combined together, and the green bars are the native born, and the blue bars are the immigrants. There's remarkable nativity and ethnicity heterogeneity in home ownership. Among immigrants, Vietnamese has by far the highest home ownership rate, followed by Chinese and Filipinos. Their home ownership rates all surpass that of white immigrants. The home ownership rate of foreign-born Vietnamese is 71%, almost 20% higher than their native-born counterparts. Similarly, foreign-born Filipino and Koreans also have higher home ownership rates than their native-born co-ethnics, although not by so much. 3/4 of US-born Japanese are homeowners. They have the highest home ownership rates among all the nativity groups. And this is consistent with past studies that native-born Japanese are the most assimilated Asian subgroup. Foreign-born Japanese, on the other hand, have the lowest home ownership rate of 39% among all nativity groups, presumably because many of them are temporal visitors. We can also see that being foreign-born does not seem to be significantly associated with home ownership for Chinese or Asian Indians. The differences are just not significant. So this is overcrowding rates for the top 10 most popular metropolitans. So it is apparent that Asian Americans are much more likely than whites to live in dense arrangements, and the immigrants are much more likely to do so than their native-born counterparts. Among the native-born, Filipino, Korean, and the Vietnamese surpassed the average rate of overall residential crowding of native-born Asian Americans among the foreign-born Filipinos, Asian Indians, and Vietnamese have substantially higher rates of residential crowding than the average rate of overall immigrant Asians. Here, this is from our fixed effects results. Those are fully adjusted results. And we can see that, I mean, the results are largely consistent with what we saw from the bivariate rates. And there are some notable findings. First of all, net of all covariates in the model, both Chinese and Vietnamese have estimated home ownership rates that surpass whites regardless of nativity, and nativity differentials are relatively small within both ethnic groups. Second, the nativity gap is overwhelmingly large in the case of Japanese. Third, Filipinos, Asian Indians, and Koreans have substantially large nativity gaps too, and their probabilities of owning a home are lower than whites, regardless of nativity status after controlling all those variables. And here is the overcrowding adjusted predicted probabilities of overcrowding. So I think I'm almost going out of time, but I'm having summarized results slides here, so we can just go over this really quickly. But this slide basically is highly consistent with the previous bivariate results. So our finding, we found that significant ethnic disparities exist in home ownership, but not much in residential crowding. Among the native-born, Chinese, Japanese, and Vietnamese Americans appear to have a net advantage in regard to home ownership over comparable whites. Chinese and Vietnamese immigrants have net advantage in home ownership over white immigrants. Notable new finding is that Vietnamese have net advantage in home ownership over whites regardless of nativity. This finding is not is new and is never mentioned in previous literature. So Asian Indians, Filipinos, and Koreans have net disadvantage over whites, even after broken down by nativity. So Asian Americans' disadvantage in residential crowding is mostly attributed to foreign-born status. But we want to emphasize that we netted out metropolitan fixed effects. So on average, if we look at national trends, we still may find Asian Americans have a lower home ownership rates than non-Hispanic whites. And we want to tentatively conclude that Asian Americans in general have attained relatively high levels of housing attributes in terms of housing tenure and the residential density, which denotes their continuing residential assimilation and upward mobility. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the questions.
Thank you so much, Jean. That will be the end of the presentation section of this session. I will start with the Q&A now. So our first question is for Jing. What is the reason for using non-Hispanic white as the comparison group rather than all non-Asians, including Black, Hispanic, Latino, AIAN, etc.?
Yes, the reason that we want to use non-Hispanic whites as a comparison group is that the past literature indicates that the Asian Americans have comparable ACS when they're compared to whites. So that's why one of the reasons we want to focus a comparison between Asian Americans and whites. There's something we actually thought about. Later, we want to also bring everybody in to have a comparison, but this is the focus of our study at this stage. Yes, thank you for asking that question. Yeah, we just want to have to be able to in conversation with previous literature about ACS, I guess.
Thank you so much. The next question is again for Jing. Could you explain metropolitan fixed effects a little?
Yes, sure. Yeah, this is a very good question. So the reason we use metropolitan fixed effects because we want to net out all the observed and unobserved metropolitan variables in terms of housing markets and even cost of living and the concentration of Asian Americans in certain metropolitan areas. So we can talk in terms of statistical inference that in a given metropolitan area, and this is the net disadvantage or advantage of certain Asian American groups compared to non-Hispanic whites.
Thank you so much. The next question is for Keith. Have you looked at FCC low broadband areas of the country published at a census tract level and overlaid on that? Caveat, FCC broadband data is skewed because it's based on one household per census tract has broadband, then has broadband.
And no, we have not, but in the past, I have looked at that data. I think it's gotten a little better. There's always, questions about it too. Rather, the speed is exactly what they say it is, particularly in rural areas. Like you said, I would, when we did our annual report, like one time I went to a remote place in Tennessee and it had it as high speed, but they said like that one building did in an entire huge county. But I think that is important. That data is important. The actual, I know we did some work earlier at one of the previous ACS user conferences, a colleague of mine, and he also looked at the issue. But yeah, no, I haven't in a while. I think it would be good to do that and just to see the actual speeds and see what's going on, because given the magnitude of the effect of COVID and the importance that it has on people's outcomes, the access to this is really critical. And I'm sure in those regions where we're talking about those high need regions, it's going to be limited access at best. And so, yes, I think that would probably be a good thing. It's difficult data to work with, and I haven't looked at it in a while, but yeah, it's been a while, and it'd probably be good to kind of revisit that because that's a big issue. And I know it's a big issue on policy grounds too, right? Expanding broadband. I think everybody's for it. So just needs more research probably to explore it.
Our next question is for Clemens. Why is it important to use census tracts to approximate zip codes when ZICTA boundaries are generally a much closer match to zip code boundaries?
Well, I guess if you have ZICTA data to study, if that is available, which it is in the ACS, of course, you would maybe use this, use the ZICTA level data and not sort of go through the process of aggregating. Just sometimes the thing you have is at the census tract level, like the life expectancy or the opportunity atlas metrics or the child opportunity index, and then you need to aggregate it if you want it at the zip code level. I mean, what we really wanted to focus on is this aggregation issue, or sort of what you miss if you work with zip code data. There's a lot, that's been done already, but I think there's still room for, some research that really focus on racial ethnic inequalities, or how children or people like of different races, ethnicities would be differentially affected by measuring neighborhood factors at the zip code rather than the census tract level. I don't think there's too much on this out there yet, and that's also something we wanted to look at. I think just one more reason. I think we published the Child Opportunity Index. My team published the Child Opportunity Index. It's at the zip code, sorry, at the census tract level. And the number one request we get from users is, do you also have this at the zip code level? We didn't aggregate it for the longest time for the reasons that I also outlined in the presentation, but there's just a lot of demand for this kind of data. And I think it's still better to use zip code data or ZICTA data than county level data if you're really interested in neighborhood level processes. So that's sort of the best thing you have in a lot of data sets, zip code level data.
Thank you, Clemens. The next question is for Keith. Can you point to a source for your definition of urban, rural, etc. for the census tracts?
Yeah, I hope in the slides in the end, I hope I referred to a report, but we have a report called Taking Stock, and it details it in there. What we did was we always, maybe I'll try to send out the link in the chat. It's on like page 112, 113. I remember working on it, but yeah, we were using county measures and it just weren't as accurate as we wanted them to be. So we moved, and you'll see it's mainly a housing density measure based on the number of units, but then we put in there also a consideration for commuting patterns. But I will chat it out here in a minute. But yes, and it's been in our report, and it's similar to some other work done by some geographers out west and with the U.S. Forest Service. A lot of times, the housing density measure is used for to determine rural frontier areas. And our measure has rural and small towns, suburban, exurban, and urban. But then it also goes back down a little further. My boss, Lance George, actually did most of the work on it. And it also we tried to break suburban down to inner and outer ring. I know there's a good bit of research done on that area as well. And so what we wanted to do was a more precise census tract estimate. And we wanted to have one that had more degrees of variation, because most of the time people say rural and suburban, but that's really not, there's so many degrees in there. So I'll put it in the chat right now. And I think it might be at the end of my slides. I meant to put it in there, and it's on 112, page 113 of this report.
Thanks, Keith. The next question, this is for Keith again. I wondered if you could say anything about how COVID-19 affected housing instability in rural areas, renters and/or owners.
Yes, honestly, I have not worked that close on that. We have done, we were keeping track of the COVID numbers, and our main focus originally was on relation to access to infrastructure in rural areas, particularly like the Navajo Nation, Native American lands in the rural Southeast. And we were particularly looking to see about the case totals and stuff like that in areas where there was no hospitals, stuff like that. Because and I didn't do much of the work on that, but like we were trying to find it, because anecdotally there was a good bit of evidence, like in the Delta and on tribal land, that these places, they had limited resources, quite frankly, to deal with COVID. And we know there was a moratorium and there were issues around renter units in rural areas, even though there are more renter units than people think. And I do not know. I know that there was a lot of concern that people could be, evictions would happen if the moratorium was not extended. And also there's the other weird, I don't know if this might be what you're getting into. I just had a call on this today. There's the other issue of then urban people were moving to rural areas. And we got a lot of that was driving up the price of land in high amenity places like in Bozeman, Montana, in North Dakota, and places like that. And so it was having another effect on rural areas of raising the price of home values. And so that's always an issue in rural areas, as you know, probably because rural areas, a lot of the people don't make much money. So if home prices go up, it's going to make more affordability more of an issue. So there's also that one. I don't have hard evidence on that. We've been looking into it more. And I'd say looking into the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data to see as far as that one goes, to where if there was a change in loans from like a Wells Fargo or something, and where it changed, and if it went to rural areas where it did, you might find areas where it put increased housing demand. It might have actually hurt homeowners that way as well, in addition to renters who would have been hurt to begin with due to the lack of income.
Thank you, Keith. Our next question is for Jean. Could you explain the choice to look at overcrowding? Would it be possible to combine ACS and CHAS data to look at severe housing problems other than overcrowding? Thank you for your paper.
So the question is about the choice of look at overcrowding. Is this, as I said in my presentation, other housing outcomes are, in terms of Asian Americans, are less studies, except for home ownership rates. We want to up, even that is not as updated, as detailed as we want it to be. So overcrowding is just one of the big indicator of housing quality and housing stability. So that's why we want to investigate in this. Well, another question is, so CHAS is, I'm not familiar with that data set. So what, I think it's housing, is a housing survey? I'm not really sure, but other housing problems I would think about is the housing instability is high. I mean, it's also less studied in general, actually, but it has a lot of correlation, or maybe there's some also causal relationship between a lot of health and wealth and children outcomes. So that's something I would investigate more. Thank you for your question.
Okay. Thank you, Jean. And our next question here is, I wonder if there is an index or if it is an attribute showing a listing of tracts by rurality, whether urban, rural, or in between.
I'll just real quick. There is like the famous like Beal codes and rural and urban continuum codes. The USDA has done a good bit of work on that. We have ours, which goes down. I don't know if it's on our website. I hope it is, but there are a few that go down, and I think the Department of Education uses one as well. But it is an issue to get down to the census tract geography. But I'm pretty sure the USDA like will have ones that are oftentimes used. In ours is based on housing density, and I don't know, the USGS used to work with that as well, but they were trying to identify areas on the fringe, like frontier type of areas. But you're right, most of the time it's a county-based measure, and it's normally like the OMB, metropolitan, non-metropolitan, and so which is fine. You know, but then there are some USDA like measures that do provide you information, not necessarily like the Beal codes. They give you, they do rate counties. The problem with some of them though is that if you have too many categories, it can get difficult to follow. So, you know, it's always the trade-off, right? I want to know more information, but if I have too many categories, then it's kind of a challenge to follow which one, you know, what they mean if there's too many gradients. I'll try to put a link in here.
Thank you, Keith. The next question is for Dr. Lee. How do you define residential crowding in ACS data?
Yes, so we define housing residential crowding in terms of whether there's more than one person per room in the house, not including hallway, kitchen, and the bathroom. That's how I remember. So we code it as one if it's over one person per room. If it's zero, if there's under one person per room. This is actually defined as overcrowding. I think sometimes people use 0.75, but we use 1.
Thank you so much. And the last question is for Dr. Lee as well. How did you measure US experience?
Okay, so this is reported only for the foreign-born. Basically, it's time since migration. There's a variable in ACS, very straightforward. So that's how I got it from the IPUMS.
Okay, it doesn't look like we have any other questions in the Q&A. And I'll just leave this time up for our three presenters if you would like to say any other remarks, and I will keep an eye on the Q&A.
I'd just like to say fabulous presentations by everybody. I learned a lot actually. There's really, I like the housing, the fixed effects models, and also the census tract sector. We worked with them some. I try to work with some of the different data. It's all quite fascinating actually. We had an issue at Chicago that dealt with some of those kind of issues. I know we do rural mainly, but and I think it's good. The home ownership you mentioned was important too. A professor that it's really important, and it's where most people generate wealth, and so it does really matter a lot. It's kind of one of those things, just as well as the census tract or the sector, the zip code you live in shapes you, like Roz Chetty's stuff. Those are all really important things. Better understanding them is really helping our communities better understand.
We just got another question. It's, do you find any differences between urban and rural crowding, thinking of migrant labor?
Is this question for me? Or
It's not addressed to anyone in particular.
okay, in terms of migrant labor, I don't I have a project unrelated with this one. Actually, we have found that for migrant laborers, they tend to live in high density arrangements. Is very has deleterious effect on their mental and physical health. This area is also very highly understudied. This something is very interesting but understudied. Yeah, something I like to explore further. We actually have been collecting data on this for migrant Mexican roofers with one of my colleagues. Our data show that they live in high density residential arrangements, and it's bad for them.
You're right. The data is really limited. It's tough to get data on that, like the NAWS, the farm worker. It's a survey they do, but there's very little. We do some work on them, and we hear a lot anecdotally, but it's a very tough population to study because it's not in one location. It's always on the move, and then policies affected, and then there's issues of trust. But in general, I think rural has less crowding, but where it does have crowding, like in the colonias along the border, or in where there's like farm workers and stuff, it is pretty serious issue, quite frankly. And that housing stock is rather porous, poorly understood, and it's really esoteric. Some of it's like USDA programs and stuff that I don't think a lot of people know a lot about.
We've received, you all have received some thanks and best regards, and also some thank yous for your presentations in the chat. I've also posted the links that Keith mentioned about the detail on the rural geography measure and the Beal codes.
I'll just say one more thing. It'd be interesting to see how the COVID impacts all these issues as well too, the pandemic, if it has any long lasting changes in any of these issues around home ownership and where people live. I've heard a lot of talk about that recently.
I guess we're waiting for updated ACS data on that.
Yeah, the data lag is really tough on that. Like we were trying to look at mortgage lending data, and by the time you get the data, the pandemic's over. I wanted to see if there was this, because we were hearing anecdotally that there was this movement to rural areas, but a lot of times that's anecdotally, or it's kind of, overplayed a little bit. But we don't have any data, so I think there's something going on there, but I don't know the degree to which it is. And you're right, there's no data, you're just waiting. Yeah.
I don't mean to, I mean, there were, of course, a lot of data being released by the Census Bureau. I just mean the data we work at the census tract level, a lot of it is averaged over 5 years, so might not even register. I mean, the last Great Recession didn't really register too much in the 5-year, say, unemployment rates. A lot of it is smoothed out.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're right. They do 5 years. So yeah, it's not the most timely. Yeah. It'd be interesting to see when they release the census data too, the decennial counts. I wonder when that's actually going to be released. I don't know if that's ever been settled yet. I mean, it's limited now, the amount of information collected, but.
So it doesn't look like there are any other questions. So we can end early if you would like. I just want to say thank you again to all of our presenters. You received many thanks and compliments in the chat. And I just wanted to also say that your presentations were great. So thank you for letting me moderate this session today. And would you like to save the chat? This is for the presenters. I'll just say yes. Okay, thank you so much. This will be the end of the session.
Thank you, Lily, and thanks everyone.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thanks, everyone. Great presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.